Today, my lecture will be on literary criticism from Philip Sidney to Matthew Arnold. The first towering personality in English literary criticism is Philip Sidney, who wrote his Apology for Poetry in about 1580. For Sidney, literature does not give us an insight into reality, but an alternative to reality. Sidney's line for defense closely follows Gausson's line of attack. Gausson had indicated poetry, saying that a man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry, that it is the mother of lies, that it is the nurse of abuse, and that Plato had rightly banished poets from his republic. But Sidney replied to all charges of Gausson. Sidney's method is that of a logician. Quoting Horace, Sidney says, "A poem is a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight." I repeat, a poem is a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. Philip Sidney attempted to apply the classical rules to English poetry. While praising the works of ancient poets of Greece and Rome, he also admires the works of Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. Poetry, according to him, is the art of inventing new things. To Sidney, poetry is an art of imitation for a specific purpose. It imitates to teach and delight. Those who practice writing of poetry are called makers and prophets. Sidney made a clear-cut distinction between literature and other forms of writing. Literature to him has a primary aim of giving pleasure to the reader, and any moral element is necessarily either subordinate or unlikely to succeed without it. Ben Jonson, echoing the thought of Philip Sidney, says, "Poesy is the queen of arts, which had her origin from heaven, received thence from the Hebrews, and had in prime estimation with the Greeks, transmitted to the Latins and all nations that professed civility." Ben Jonson judged the writings of Spenser, Marlowe, Bacon, Shakespeare from neoclassical standards of order and restraint. Though he speaks very high of Bacon for his neatness and style, he calls Shakespeare unschooled genius. Discussing the relationship between literature and life, Dryden pointed out that imaginative literature gives us an image of human nature. Upholding Aristotle's definition of poetry as a process of imitation, he takes pains to emphasize the forms of imitation. He defends Shakespeare's use of the supernatural, founded on popular beliefs, for it is still an imitation of things as they ought to be. Dryden says, "As truth is the end of all our speculations, so the discovery of it is the pleasure of them, and since a true knowledge of nature gives us pleasure, a lively imitation of it, either in poetry or painting, must of necessity produce a much greater for both these arts." The poet, Dryden believes, is neither a leader nor a bare imitator, but a creator who observes life or nature as his raw material. Drama claimed most of Dryden's attention. He believes in the definition of tragedy as propounded by Aristotle: an imitation of one entire, great and probable action, not told but represented, which by moving in us fear and pity is conducive to the purging of those two emotions in our minds. Dryden closely followed Aristotle and Horace in his study of tragedy. But Dryden has no use for the group of characters called chorus in the Greek tragedy. While mentioning about the rules laid down by Aristotle, Dryden is of the opinion that it is not the observance of rules that makes a work great, but its capacity to delight and transport. Dryden prefers Shakespeare with all his lapses. He is a liberal classicist who adjusts to rules of the ancients to the genius of the age to which a poet writes. Dr. Johnson's Lives of the Poets and Prefaces to Shakespeare is a major breakthrough in critical theory. Dr. Johnson gave a detailed commentary on the works of Shakespeare, and prior to this Only the Bible was subjected to intensive scrutiny. According to Dr. Johnson, literature is not written to a fixed pattern, but is conditioned by the writer's age and environment. Writing on Shakespeare, he says, Shakespeare has no heroes. His scenes are occupied by men who act and speak as the reader thinks that he should himself have spoken or acted on the same occasion. Even where the agency is supernatural, the dialogue is level with life. Now I switch over to Romantic movement, Romanticism. With the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798, a new wave of literary theory flourished. The book blends high literature constructed on the models of the popular oral ballet of ordinary country people. The distinction that Wordsworth makes between truth individual and local and truth general and operative is similar to Aristotle's distinction between historical and poetic truth. Wordsworth, whose incidents and situations from common life, he says, "My purpose was to imitate and as far as possible to adopt the very language of men, and assuredly such personification do not make any natural a regular part of that language. There will also be found in these volumes little of what is usually called poetic diction, as much pains has been taken to avoid it, as is ordinarily taken to produce it, to bring my knowledge near to the language of men." He defines good poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. By spontaneity in poetry, he did not reject the workmanship. He composed his poem with great care. Wordsworth opposed the neoclassical practice of judging a work of art. His critical writings mark the end of the old school and the beginning or revival of an older one, the Romantic school of the Elizabethans. Coleridge based his literary criticism on philosophical principles. He finds two forms of imagination, which he calls the primary and the secondary. The primary imagination is simply the power of perceiving the objects of sense, persons, places, things, both in their parts and as wholes. The secondary imagination is the conscious use of the power. It is a composite faculty of the soul consisting of all the other faculties: perception, intellect, will, emotions. Coleridge, with his scholarly studies in metaphysics and philosophy, tried, in the words of T.S. Eliot, attention to the profundity of the philosophical problems into which the study of poetry may take us. Salisbury says, "So then, there abide these three, Aristotle, Longinus, and Coleridge. We cannot quite say that he is the greatest of the three, but his range is necessarily wider. He takes in as their date forbids them to take all literature in a way which must for centuries to come give him the prerogative." Shelley believes that imagination brings the poet in touch with the nuances of ideas and reality. According to him, a poem is the record of the best and happiest moments of the happiest and best minds. The poets, according to Shelley, are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Shelley says, "Poetry is indeed something divine. It is at once the center and circumference of knowledge. It is that which comprehends all science and that to which all science must be referred." Shelley's A Defense of Poetry sees poetry essentially which strips the veil of familiarity from the world. It purges from our inward sight the film of familiarity. It compels us to feel that which we perceive and to imagine that which we know. Similarly, Keats, an ardent worshipper of beauty, believes in truth of imagination. Keats did not write formal critical theory, but expressed his opinion through letters and small notes. He says, "The simple, imaginative mind may have its rewards in the repetition of its own silent working, coming continually on the spirit with a fine suddenness. The theory is based on Freud's concept. The silent working of the mind is the unconscious, and the spirit into which it erupts is the conscious." Keats's idea of negative capability is very near to this idea. According to him, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any imitable reaching after the fact and reason. Rules framed by neoclassical school were demolished by the romantic school. The old rules were dead and new one took its place. After the romantics, the main development in critical theory were the work of the late Victorians like Matthew Arnold and Henry James. The change in thinking was brought with the rise of democracy and the advancement of science. The industry increased the comforts of life and science challenged the biblical version of creation in 7 days. On the question of the function of poetry, Matthew Arnold could not conceive of poetry as something apart from life. He says, in poetry, however, the criticism of life has to be made comfortably to the laws of poets. In poetry, however, the criticism of life has to be made comfortably to the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty. Truth and seriousness of substance and matter, felicity and perfection of diction and manner as they are exhibited in best poets. The future of poetry is immense because in poetry, where it is worthy of high destinies, our race, as time goes on, will find an ever surer and surer stay. The strongest part of religion is its unconscious poetry. More and more mankind will discover that we turn to poetry to interpret his life for us, to consider us, to sustain us. Without poetry, our science will appear incomplete, and most of what now passes with us for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry. Despite his classical learning, his approach is liberal. Arnold has remained a key figure in the history of English criticism. He saw literature as a replacement for religion. According to him, the goal of literary criticism is of attaining disinterested knowledge, of simply appreciating the object as in itself. For Arnold, the key literary critical device is the notion of the touchstone, which avoids any definitions of desirable literary qualities and suggests using aspects of literature of the past as a means of measuring and assessing the literature of today. He raised criticism to a higher level that was never thought. Today I stop here. I'll continue tomorrow with Victorian attitude and then I will move forward.